Why? Why did people pay almost double the price for the PlayStation 5 when it first released, even though Sony didn't change its prices? What happened there? This, in economics, is explained through shifts in demand and supply. Hi, friends. Welcome to Econverse. I'm Abrar, and I'm a fellow student who topped in GCSE Economics last year. On this channel, we make learning economics simpler, clearer, and hopefully a lot more fun. In this video, we're going to be looking at the fundamental concept of price changes. So, let's get started. For price changes, if you remember in the previous few videos, we'd looked at the concepts of demand and obviously supply. So let's just try to recap these two key concepts. So firstly, what is demand? Demand is the willingness and ability of consumers to buy a product. But this only affects consumers. So this is in the consumer point of view. On the other hand, supply is the willingness and ability of producers to sell a product. Now, if you remember the diagrams, I'd recommend that you watch those videos. So I've attached them in the description below. So a demand curve is a curve that is downward sloping, and a supply curve is a curve that is upward sloping. Now, if you remember, the axes on a demand and supply curve, the y-axis is the price and the x-axis is the quantity, P and Q. Now, demand and prices are inversely related, if you remember. So now when you look at price changes, essentially the price changes happen due to shifts. So when you look at shifts in a demand curve, you could have two types of shifts. You could have something called a rightward shift, which is when the demand for a product increases, or you could have something you call a leftward shift, when the demand for the product decreases. So I've denoted the decrease in red and the increase in green. Let's try and do the same for supply. I want you to try and do this for yourself before you look at this. Yes, you're right. So you have the supply moving to the right when the supply increases, and the supply moving to the left when supply decreases. So now we've looked at how the price could change when the levels of supply change. Now, when the levels of supply or demand change. Now let's try and put them both in one diagram. So this is essentially where all of it starts to interconnect. If you remember in the previous video, we looked at how when demand and supply interact, this particular point at which they meet is called the equilibrium point. So we have the equilibrium point as the point where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Now let's look at something fascinating. Let's look at a demand and supply curve, and let's have some scenarios that we consider. Let's say this is the demand and this is the supply. So what do? You put the dots to connect where it is at the price level and where it is at the quantity level. This is your P and this is your Q. Now let's have a scenario when the supply increases to S1 due to improvement in technology, but the demand for the product decreases due to fall in tastes and preferences. Now, if you can see, the first equilibrium of this was essentially at this point. Now, the equilibrium of this is here. If you can notice, the equilibrium point has gone down from here to here. Let's try and denote this impact. So you have the price level that's fallen, and somewhat you could say that the quantity is around the same. So when the supply increases and demand decreases, price decreases. Now, I want you to think about this example in your own real life. So, whenever there's something that's high in supply and low in demand, what can firms do to ensure that they sell out? They have to decrease the prices in order to ensure that demand increases or meets the level of supply. Now, let's look at another example. What if you have a situation where the demand curve of the economy increases to D1 and you have the supply curve of the economy that decreases to S1? So you have that. Now let's take a look at the changes in the equilibrium, prices and quantity. So at first you have the equilibrium of P here and equilibrium Q here. So essentially you have the diagram like that. Now after the shifts, if you can see, they are intersecting at P1 and somewhat the same Q. So at first the equilibrium point is here and now it's here. So what can we see here? We can see that when the demand for the good increases while the supply decreases, there's a massive rise in prices. Now this can be seen in the cases of any popular good. Whenever you have something that is trending or that's high in demand, often the supply of it is decreased in order for the prices to increase and for the firms to make massive profits. Now let's look at two other examples. Let's look at an example where both demand and supply increase. So you have S and you have S1 with a positive supply, with an increasing supply, and then you have D and you have D1 where supply also increases. Demand also increases. So alright, so you have P and Q here, and then you have P1 and Q1. So essentially if you see, there is a rise in the quantity and a fall in the price level. So when both demand and supply improve or increase, prices decrease and the quantity demanded and supplied increases. So that's why when both demand and supply increase, it provides a massive benefit for the economy. And for the last example, let's try and look at a scenario where both demand and supply deteriorate or decrease. Let's look at demand 1, where demand shifts to the left. And let's look at supply and supply 1, where supply also shifts to the left. So if you notice carefully, price level before it is somewhat here. So P, there's a slight rise in price. This is because the shifts that I've shown are actually quite small. And you can see that this is the difference in the quantity. So you have Q and you have Q1. Essentially, if you can see, when both demand fall and supply falls, it leads to prices rising and quantity supplied and demanded falling. What does this indicate? This clearly indicates that when both demand and supply deteriorate, the economy performs worse. So that's 4 diagrams. I want you to think about many more different diagrams. Put together these diagrams, try to find some real scenarios, and essentially play with all of this. Try to understand the depth of demand and supply in your real life, because that is when you'll truly start enjoying economics. If you think this video helped you understand economics better, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join the Econverse. I'll see you in the next video where we look at the price elasticity of demand.